There's something almost mythic about the sound of it, the sharp, rolling chatter of the Thompson. It's a sound that once echoed in Chicago's back alleys, in smoky warehouses, in the nightmares of Prohibition-era gangsters and the lawmen chasing them. But what most people don't realize is that this same weapon, the so-called Tommy gun of American crime law, would later march across Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa, carried by soldiers fighting not for territory or profit, but for the survival of the free world. It's a strange twist of fate, isn't it? That a gun once tied to bootleggers and bank robbers would become one of the symbols of Allied victory in World War II. Before we dive into that incredible transformation, make sure you're subscribed. If you love real history told with heart and grit, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow history buffs, and stay with me till the end, because this story, well, this one's got everything. Ambition, tragedy, redemption, and a touch of Hollywood drama. Now let's go back to where it all began, long before the mobsters, before the trenches of Normandy, before anyone had ever heard the name Tommy Gun. The story starts with a man named John Taliaferro Thompson, a career army officer, a man obsessed with one idea: to create the perfect trench broom, a weapon that could sweep enemy soldiers out of dugouts and bunkers in close combat. It was 1917. The First World War was devouring men by the thousands, and Thompson, a logistics expert, saw how desperately soldiers needed something fast and portable, something more effective than a bolt-action rifle in the hellish maze of trench warfare. Thompson began working with a small team of engineers and a company he called Auto Ordnance, trying to turn his vision into steel and gunpowder. The design he imagined was radical for its time, a weapon that fired pistol ammunition but at machine gun speed. It would be compact, easy to handle, capable of spitting out .45 caliber rounds faster than anything the Army had ever seen. He called it a submachine gun, a new term for a new kind of warfare. But here's where irony steps in. By the time the weapon was ready, the war was over. The armistice came in November 1918, and the world suddenly had no need for trench brooms anymore. Thompson's masterpiece had missed its war. The military wasn't interested, budgets were slashed, and Auto Ordnance found itself holding a revolutionary weapon with no buyers. What do you do when your invention is too late for the battlefield, but too deadly to ignore? You sell it to whoever's willing to pay. And in the Roaring '20s, America was full of men with money and no conscience. The Thompson hit the civilian market in 1921, marketed with unsettling pride as the Annihilator. It was supposed to be sold to police, security firms, and anyone needing serious firepower. But in an age of prohibition, bootleggers, and organized crime, the Thompson found a very different clientele. The streets of Chicago, New York, and Detroit became its proving ground. Gangsters like Al Capone, John Dillinger, and Babyface Nelson turned the Thompson into a legend of fear. The 50-round drum magazine, nicknamed the Chicago typewriter, could unleash a storm of bullets so fast that witnesses often thought they'd heard one long note rather than a series of shots. In the dim light of a speakeasy or the echoing walls of a back alley garage, the sound was unmistakable. But if the gangsters loved it, so did the law. The FBI, the Treasury agents, and even local police forces began carrying Thompsons of their own. It was the first time America's criminals and its crime fighters were armed with the same weapon. In a way, the Thompson became the gun that defined a nation at war with itself. It represented both sides of the law, both the chaos and the order trying to contain it. By the late 1920s, the Thompson's reputation was so stained with blood that many Americans saw it as the devil's instrument. The St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929 cemented that image. 7 men cut down in a Chicago garage, their bodies riddled with .45 caliber rounds from Thompsons. The photos horrified the public. Newspapers called for bans. Politicians demanded action. The Tommy gun had become a symbol of everything wrong with the modern age. violence, greed, lawlessness. And yet, just a decade later, the same weapon would be handed to soldiers hailed as heroes. How could that happen? How does a weapon go from criminal icon to military staple? The answer, as always, lies in war. When the world descended once more into conflict in 1939, the United States was watching cautiously from across the Atlantic. But the US military was small, under-equipped, and still armed with outdated rifles and pistols. Then came 1940 and the fall of France. Suddenly, the threat of global fascism felt real, urgent. The army dusted off old designs, looking for anything that could be produced quickly, supply and perform reliably. And somewhere in the stacks of forgotten blueprints sat John Thompson's creation. The army re-examined it, tested it, and found that despite its flashy gangster past, the Thompson was rugged, accurate at short range, and devastating in close combat. It could fill a niche no other American weapon could. Production resumed, and by the time the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the Tommy gun was back in business, this time in uniform. What's almost poetic is that Thompson himself lived to see it happen. He'd retired from active service, but he watched as his invention, once scorned, was finally accepted as a weapon of war. Soldiers were trained to use it in every theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Guadalcanal. The same .45 caliber punch that had once rattled the streets of Chicago now tore through Nazi positions in Normandy and Japanese bunkers in the Pacific. But there were differences. The military Thompsons weren't the flashy, polished models that gangsters had loved. These were stripped-down, battle-ready tools. The early M1928 A1 models still had the classic finned barrel and cuts compensator, but later versions like the M1 and M1A1 were simplified. No more fancy engravings, no drum magazines, just a plain box magazine and a solid wooden stock. They were heavy, yes, almost 10 pounds unloaded, but soldiers swore by them. They could take abuse, mud, sand, and still fire. In war, that's what mattered. The British got them too, through Lend-Lease. Early in the war, when Britain stood alone against Hitler, shiploads of Thompsons were sent across the Atlantic. They were expensive, around $200 a piece at the time, but Churchill's men were desperate. British commandos, paratroopers, and even the Home Guard trained with them. It's said that some soldiers called it the Yank Tommy, while others nicknamed it the Trench Broom, echoing Thompson's original dream from 1917. Of course, there were complaints. Some soldiers found it too heavy, others thought it wasted ammunition. But in the chaos of close-quarter battle, no one doubted its value. In the hedgerows of France, in the narrow streets of Italian towns, in the thick greenery of New Guinea, the Thompson earned respect. When things got up close and personal, there was no better companion. There's an account from a US Marine who fought on Guadalcanal. He said the Thompson wasn't just a weapon, it was a lifeline. You felt safe with it, he recalled. You could hear the jungle breathing, and you knew if anything came out of that darkness, the Thompson would answer faster than you could think. That's the kind of trust no machine earns easily. But even as the Thompson rose to glory, it carried its past like a scar. Soldiers joked about it being a gangster gun, humming 1920s jazz tunes as they cleaned it, or pretending to be mobsters during training. There was something about that mix of history, of crime and heroism, that made the weapon iconic in a way no other firearm could match. It was both sinner and saint, outlaw and liberator. And perhaps that's what makes its story so human. We're all capable of both. If you're still with me, that tells me you're one of those people who really feels history. The texture of it, the irony, the heartbeat underneath the dates. So before we move on to the next part, where the Thompson becomes a true symbol of Allied might across Europe, make sure you're subscribed. It's stories like this that show how even the darkest chapters of history can lead to redemption. Because the Thompson's story isn't just about war, it's about transformation. And what comes next will surprise you even more. Europe was burning. Cities once filled with laughter and light now echoed with the sound of artillery and the low growl of engines. By 1942, the Thompson Submachine Gun had found its place in that chaos, cradled in the hands of American, British, and Commonwealth soldiers pushing back against tyranny. The same gun that once rattled Chicago alleys was now kicking up dust on Sicilian beaches and spitting fire in the streets of Cayenton. The Thompson wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a symbol of grit, of defiance, of raw human will. Soldiers carried it with a sense of confidence that bordered on affection. It was heavy, yes, but it had character. The solid wood, the familiar thud of the .45 ACP round, it felt personal. When American troops landed in North Africa in late 1942, the Thompson led the way. Operation Torch marked the first large-scale use of US forces in the European theater, and the weapon quickly earned a reputation. In close fighting through narrow village streets and winding desert trenches, the Thompson's short range became its strength. British commandos loved it for the same reason. They used it during daring raids on occupied France and Norway, fast, brutal, and effective. You could say it fit the commando spirit perfectly. Small teams, close contact, sir. Prize and total aggression. The Thompson didn't need distance to be deadly. Then came Italy. From Sicily to Monte Cassino, Allied forces slogged through some of the harshest fighting of the war. Rain, mud, ruined towns. It was the kind of terrain where rifles were clumsy and machine guns too cumbersome. The Thompson was the bridge between them. There's a photograph of an American infantryman in Salerno. Helmet tilted, sleeves rolled up, Thompson tucked under his arm as he moves through shattered ruins. You can almost feel the tension in the picture, the weight of the weapon, the exhaustion in his eyes. But the true test was still ahead. Normandy, June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious invasion in history. On D-Day, Thompsons were everywhere, slung across the backs of paratroopers, jumping from C-47s into the cold pre-dawn air, clutched by rangers scaling the cliffs of Point du Hoc, carried by engineers clearing obstacles on Omaha Beach. In that first hour, when chaos ruled and nothing went according to plan, the Thompson's simplicity and reliability mattered more than anything. You didn't have time to think about ballistics or accuracy. You just needed something that fired when your life depended on it. A paratrooper from the 101st Airborne later recalled how his Thompson jammed once after landing near St. Mary-Glise. He stripped it, cleaned it with mud-caked hands, and got it working again within minutes. He said, "That gun saved my life twice before sunrise." The Thompson wasn't perfect. It was heavy, it burned through ammunition like water, and its effective range was short. But when you were fighting from hedgerow to hedgerow, clearing houses, or ambushing German patrols, nothing compared. It delivered brute stopping power that soldiers trusted. Even the enemy respected it. German troops nicknamed it the trench broom, or sometimes simply the American. And whenever they captured one, they used it themselves. There are countless photos of German Fallschirmjägers and SS troops carrying captured Thompsons during the war. That's how good it was. Your enemy wanted your gun. Across Europe, the weapon's distinct rhythm echoed through the battlefields. Rat-tat-tat-tat, fast, deep, controlled. Not the high-pitched rattle of an MP40 or the shrill bark of a Sten, but a deep growl like a drumbeat of war. Some soldiers said they could tell a Thompson from a mile away. That sound became part of the Allied advance, as recognizable as the rumble of Sherman tanks or the whine of P-51s overhead. By the time Allied forces liberated Paris, the Thompson had already become an icon of resistance. French partisans, armed with smuggled or airdropped Thompsons, had used them in ambushes and sabotage operations. There's a famous photograph taken in August 1944, young French fighters standing on a captured German truck, waving flags. one of them holding a Thompson over his shoulder. It's not just a weapon in that image, it's liberation itself, captured in metal and wood. But victory wasn't cheap. Soldiers who carried the Thompson often spoke of the bond they had with it, especially after losing friends in combat. The weapon became more than a tool. It was something familiar in a world that made no sense. Some men even gave theirs nicknames. They'd clean them meticulously, carry spare magazines in every pocket, and trust them like brothers. As the war moved deeper into Germany, through shattered towns and forests littered with the wreckage of war, the Thompson remained at the front. By 1945, newer designs like the M3 grease gun were starting to appear, lighter, cheaper, more efficient. But most soldiers preferred the old Tommy. The M3 was practical, yes, but it didn't have the same presence, the same balance. The Thompson had soul. In the Pacific, that soul looked different. There, the Thompson met a new kind of war, thick jungles, humid heat, enemies that appeared from nowhere. Marines on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa swore by it. Its stopping power was crucial against Japanese soldiers who often fought to the death. The M1A1 Thompson, with its simplified design and stick magazines, was perfectly suited for the close, brutal fighting of the islands. There's a haunting quote from a Marine sergeant who fought at Tarawa. He said, "The Thompson didn't just stop a man, it ended a charge. You could feel it. It was ugly work, but it kept you alive." And that's the truth of it. The Thompson's legend wasn't built in laboratories or press releases. It was built in the mud, the blood, the noise of battle. By 1945, over 1.5 million Thompsons had been produced. They were carried by soldiers, commandos, paratroopers, partisans, and police all over the world. When victory finally came, the Tommy gun was there. At the surrender ceremonies, in the parades, in the photographs of soldiers leaning on their rifles, smiling through the relief of survival. It had started as a dream in 1917, rejected, criminalized, then redeemed by war. Few inventions have lived such a life. Fewer still have symbolized both sides of human nature so completely. But the story doesn't end with victory. The Tommy gun would go on to serve long after the last shots of World War II were fired. In Korea, in Vietnam, even in conflicts across Africa and the Middle East, it kept showing up. In the next part, we'll see how the Thompson became a weapon of revolution and resistance, used by freedom fighters, soldiers of fortune, and even Hollywood filmmakers who turned it into a legend that would never die. The Tommy gun was more than a machine. It was a mirror of the century itself, flawed, powerful, unforgettable. When the smoke of World War II finally lifted, the world stood in ruins, and yet the Thompson Submachine Gun, old, heavy, a relic by some standards, refused to fade away. It had survived the gangsters, the Great Depression, and the deadliest war in human history. You'd think that would be enough for one lifetime, but the Tommy gun had other plans. In the years that followed, as nations rebuilt and old empires fell apart, the Thompson found itself in the hands of new warriors. Some fought for freedom, others for power. And through it all, that same deep, rhythmic chatter echoed through jungles, deserts, and city streets. It was still a voice of war. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, American troops once again reached for the familiar. Many units were still armed with the M1A1 Thompson in those first brutal months. The weapon's close-range dominance was invaluable in the frozen trenches and tight mountain passes of Korea, where battles were often fought within shouting distance. It kicked, it bucked, it froze, but it fired when it mattered. Veterans of World War II felt an odd comfort in its presence, like an old friend had come along for one last fight. The Thompson also became a symbol of resistance during the early Cold War years. Across Europe, underground movements and partisans who had kept their wartime weapons refused to give them up. In Greece, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe, where ideological wars replaced national ones, the Thompson appeared again, this time not as a symbol of armies, but of individuals caught in the new storm of global politics. It was used by rebels and loyalists alike, its history too deep to belong to one side anymore. Even in faraway colonies where independence movements were rising, the Thompson found its way into the story. British and French colonial troops had carried them during the war, and after 1945, many of those weapons slipped quietly into black markets and resistance arsenals. In the hands of Vietnamese fighters, Algerian rebels, and Cuban revolutionaries, the Tommy gun became a weapon of liberation. Its roar, once tied to Chicago alleys and European battlefields, now rang out in the jungles of Indochina and the streets of Havana. Fidel Castro's men used Thompsons during the Cuban Revolution in the late 1950s, captured from corrupt officers or bought through backdoor channels. Photographs of young bearded revolutionaries smiling with Thompsons slung across their shoulders became emblems of a new world reshaping itself. In some ways, it was poetic. The gun of American gangsters turned into the tool of global revolution. History has a dark sense of humor that way. Back home in the United States, the Thompson had become more than a weapon. It was an icon. Hollywood embraced it, and in doing so, immortalized it. Films like The Roaring Twenties, Scarface, and later Bonnie and Clyde brought the Tommy gun roaring back into the public imagination. That drum magazine, the way it spat fire from a hip-high grip, it became cinematic shorthand for danger, rebellion, power. Even when newer, sleeker guns came along, filmmakers and audiences kept returning to the Thompson. It wasn't just a firearm anymore, it was a character. War veterans who'd carried one overseas felt a strange pride seeing it on screen. It wasn't the same gun they knew. It had been stylized, dramatized, but it carried the same soul. The same heavy click of the bolt, the same defiant rhythm of its fire. It reminded them of who they'd been and what they'd survived. By the time the Vietnam War began, the Thompson was considered outdated by the US military. The M16 had taken its place as the modern standard. But still, Thompsons turned up, used by South Vietnamese forces, by special units, even by American advisors early in the conflict. Some were war surplus from the 1940s, still reliable, still deadly. In dense jungle ambushes, that old-fashioned .45 slug did what it always had. It stopped a man cold. What's remarkable is how the Thompson endured in so many corners of the world long after the factories in Connecticut stopped making them. It was expensive, sure, but it was built to last. Thousands of them were donated, sold, or smuggled into conflict zones across Asia, Africa, and Latin America during the Cold War. Wherever you saw revolution or unrest, odd. Where you'd see a Thompson leaning against a wall somewhere, its wooden stock darkened with age and oil, its drum or stick magazine waiting patiently. And it didn't just stay on the battlefield. Police departments across the US held onto their Thompsons well into the 1960s. The FBI used them for training demonstrations, some even for ceremonial purposes. The gun that had once symbolized lawlessness had become a symbol of law and order. There's a strange symmetry in that, how something born in chaos could, in time, be trusted to preserve peace. But maybe that's the story of the Thompson itself. It lived in both worlds. It was a gangster's gun and a soldier's friend, a villain's toy and a hero's shield. It represented everything messy about the 20th century, the contradictions, the violence, the courage, and the invention. By the late 20th century, the Tommy gun had transformed once again, from tool to relic. Collectors sought them out, museums displayed them behind glass, and reenactors carried them proudly to honor the soldiers who once fought with them. You could still feel the weight of history when you picked one up, the solid steel receiver, the smooth wood grip worn by countless hands. You could almost hear the echo of its bark in the distance. Every weapon tells a story, but the Thompson's is unusually human. It began as one man's dream, John T. Thompson's hope to save soldiers lives through firepower and ended as a symbol that transcended war itself. It showed how invention can't always control its destiny, how tools of defense can become tools of destruction, and yet somehow redemption can come from both. The Thompson became a bridge across eras, linking Prohibition to D-Day, Stalingrad to Saigon, and soldiers to citizens. It shaped pop culture, altered warfare, and carried with it a lesson about the dual nature of human ingenuity. And when you think about it, that deep, rhythmic sound it made, the steady rat-tat-tat, wasn't just noise. It was the soundtrack of an age where men and women fought, built, destroyed, and rebuilt. It was the heartbeat of a century learning what it meant to wield power, to lose control, to fight for something larger than themselves. So when you see an old Thompson today, sitting behind glass in a museum or slung across the shoulder of an actor playing a soldier or a gangster, remember what it represents. Not just violence, not just war, but endurance. The story of how something born in the darkness of crime found redemption in the struggle for freedom. It's strange, isn't it, how even a weapon can tell us so much about humanity, our flaws, our brilliance, our endless fight to survive and to mean something. The Thompson wasn't perfect, but neither were the people who carried it. And yet, together, they helped write one of the most unforgettable chapters in modern history. So the next time you hear that unmistakable rat-tat-tat in an old film or a documentary, listen closely. Behind that sound is the echo of Chicago gangsters, Normandy soldiers, jungle fighters, and the hands of men who lived and died, believing that a gun, any gun, could somehow make sense of the chaos around them. The Thompson Submachine Gun may have started as a gangster's tool, but it ended as a warrior's companion. And maybe, just maybe, as a reminder that history's most unlikely heroes sometimes come wrapped in oil, steel, and smoke. And if you've been enjoying these stories of the machines, the men, and the moments that shaped our world, don't forget, hit that subscribe button like this video and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered, told, and passed on. That's what history really is, a chorus of echoes, some loud, some faint, all carrying forward the human story, one heartbeat, one trigger pull, one unforgettable legend at a time.